Okay, welcome everybody to this month's webinar, Stop the Insanity. What we are doing today is giving you 10 examples of times that a client has run into the same sort of problem, mistake, or perhaps a situation that just takes a long time, and how we're using Spitfire itself to solve those problems. So we're going to have a format where I introduce the Spitfire feature very briefly, and then I'm going to pass the mic first to Stan and then later on to Dennis to talk about a specific situation at a specific client site and what was sort of the problem there and then what we did about it. I should mention that I normally am the one who watches the chat window in the GoToMeeting panel, and I'm not going to be able to do that today. So if you have questions, perhaps in between some of the, each topic, you can ask your questions. And then at the end, time permitting, we will open the floor up for questions also. Okay, so we're going to get started talking about our first feature, which is compliance. Now, Spitfire offers several built-in compliance types, from liability and workman's comp and insurance expiration and things like that. And some of you are using compliance. The primary role of compliance tracking is to prevent a liability risk because subs on a project are out of compliance, and maybe you didn't know that. So by default, compliance will block approval of payments to the subcontractors that are out of compliance so that the invoice never hits accounts payable. And this all works, of course, if people are actually putting in compliance information to begin with. So let's see, Stan, what was happening at Advanced Roofing, one of our client sites?
Okay, Advanced Roofing is, they're a Florida-based roofing specialty subcontractor. They've got one office, back office, that's handling several locations, it is, I believe. So they're a very busy group of folks handling a lot of volume. Compliance, but we can all agree that it's really important to track. Spitfire can't help you track compliance about things it doesn't know about. Someone has to remember to enter the details about insurance or the like. And what they noticed at Advanced Roofing was quite simply that in the rush to get a subcontract set up, sometimes they were not going to the compliance tab at all to enter that information. And of course, once the information, with it missing, that liability would be an exposure down the line. What's key here in my thinking all the time is that the people creating the subcontracts aren't the one whose job is affected by the lack of the data. They have no immediate investment in remembering to get that data entered and stuff. It doesn't affect them, it affects someone else. And that's one of the things that humans always have trouble remembering, is something I'm doing for someone else. So let's see what we did to help them out at Advanced Roofing. This is a very simple, and it's a great example to get us our toes wet here, because it's one of the simplest possible things. Advanced Roofing was satisfied with just adding a reminder to the screen on the new. You can notice that we got a picture of a subcontract here. At the very bottom, the status is in process. Brand new subcontracts, as they're created, there's a message up near that save icon, remember to verify insurance. That's all they needed, was that small reminder that this is the time I'm supposed to do that. And that was enough to, people want to do their jobs, they just need a little help remembering now and then. So how did we do this for them? Okay. Since version 2017 of Spitfire, we've had these great JavaScript extensions, the ability to add a little bit of JavaScript, which is client browser code that runs on the person's workstation. And because it's right there on the person's workstation, it can watch the values of fields and be extremely responsive and put something like a message on the screen at the right time, as you just saw in the previous picture. So this is a snippet. You need a little help deploying it if you wanted to do something like this, but it's a great first example because of its simplicity and straightforward. It's just based on the fact that it's a subcontract and it's still in process. What's next?
Well, next, we're talking about budgets from estimates. We know that many clients use estimating software at the start of a new or potential job, and so Spitfire allows you to take that data from the estimate and use it to populate the initial project budget. A lot of our clients do that. And so one way to do that is to attach a special workbook to the project setup document. Some people attach it to some other doc type, but others to the project setup document. And then that information on that workbook later is used by the people creating the budget through the import wizard process. So let's see what was happening though at a particular client site.
The client that wishes to remain nameless. Okay. So we all wear a lot of hats in the jobs we do. And let's face it, projects aren't the kind of thing we do all day. Creating new projects isn't the kind of thing we do all day, every day. It's more of the occasional piece of work. So sometimes it's harder to remember the things we only do a couple of times a week. And again, if we have that example of if I forget to do something and it's no sweat for me, it's going to be the next person in the chain who is inconvenienced. I may stumble and forget to do something once in a while. So the requirement at this site, their SOP was that the estimator has passed along, hey, the estimator did an estimate, they're passing along that information, we won the job, set this project up for us. And one of the simple tasks that had to be done was attaching the estimate workbook to the bottom of the project setup document. But it was an easy step to forget, which would lead to delays down the line. And every once in a while, they actually would call support and say, why isn't not the information not there? So what did we do for them? Okay, so you might say it's a little similar to what we did for advanced roofing, that there's messages, but instead of a single message, there's a couple going on here. One of the things we were able to do to help was that while doing a new project, just like while doing a new commitment, while doing a new project, we keep watching the bottom of the screen to say, is there an Excel workbook on this new project yet? Have they remembered to drag and drop it on to attach? And, so if it's not there yet, the estimate workbook has not yet been attached. There's a nice reminder up by that save icon. It's a great place for little reminders like that. And once or twice, they attached like an empty workbook. It was the wrong workbook that, you pick something up off your desktop and drag the wrong thing. May feel like you did the steps correctly, but the software is actually able to make sure that that workbook had items in it so that the data would flow down the stream and be available to the person who was going to work on the budget in a little while. How do we do all this? This was also done with JavaScript. Again, these things that are right there in the user interface all the time, reacting to the document status and state as it changes. So the top section is doing a couple of checks to see if there's attached files and if there's any items yet. And then the yellow block is picking which message to show on the screen, depending on the state of affairs that has been detected. So little tiny bits of JavaScript can really help people remember their P's and Q's effectively. What do we have next?
Okay, so next we are talking about forecasting, and we're going to talk about forecasting later on, but this is the first mention of forecasting. As people generally know, there are 3 modes to the BFA workbook: budget, forecast, and analysis, and the forecast mode is used to look ahead and forecast profitability. So one column of information in the forecast mode is the forecast at completion, FAC, and many of our clients use this information to drive revenue recognition. But what was happening at Orion Marine Group, Stan?
This one's very interesting, and it's a great example of the types of things that happen when something only comes. We talked about creating projects a couple of times a week. Well, this is the type of situation that only came up like once or twice a year. And I guess the first piece that we want to re-emphasize is that particularly larger shops use forecast revenue for revenue recognition. and the project management staff is often involved in that process and is very comfortable. That's what they do all the time, monthly forecasts, so that the revenue recognition can stay up to date. But then, every once in a while, projects do get canceled. Situations change, funding gets dried up from the customer. Who knows? But it happens. It's real life. If you've got enough going on, something's going to get canceled. The thing is, when that cancellation happens, the project manager isn't thinking about his forecasting role. They just want to get this thing off get it out of the picture. And they would go in and set that project to canceled. Meanwhile, there was still forecast revenue from as if. A month later, a quarter later, the financial people would be perturbed to find they still had revenue to recognize, and the books don't balance anymore. So this was the sort of situation where months would go by between the act of canceling the project and having it cause a problem for an entirely different person. So what could we possibly do to help in this situation? This is the sort of thing that software is great at watching for. If the project has forecast revenue that exceeds the actual revenue, because sometimes on these canceled projects there might have already been some money that has changed hands and been spent, discovery or whatever the cause may be. So the real trigger is that there's more forecast revenue than actual revenue, and it can present a message on this screen. And that the solution, and getting to see this message, they understand that, well, we've got to go fix that forecast revenue. We're not going to be getting it on a canceled project. How did we pull this one off? So this is an example of something that doesn't happen in real time on the screen for the user, but something that's being done when they try to save the document with the new canceled state. So you see doc state equals C would be the canceled part there. And if that's what's going on, it goes and it checks the forecast actual and the forecast at completion amounts and can compare them quite simply. So the SQL extensions like these are a little bit harder to deploy than JavaScript, than what we saw in the first couple of examples, but older sites still on 2016, for example, this was the go-to way of approaching these requirements. What do we have next?
Well, we're still talking about forecasting, but this time we're talking about a different issue at a different client site.
Okay. So let's see. Okay. Very different picture this time, in that ongoing projects that have months or maybe even a year plus in their lifespan, there will be parts of that project ramp up, and maybe the shutdown part of the project where the forecast that the project manager needs to do doesn't have a change. No change this month, nothing's going on right now. Well, in that scenario, some project managers figured out that they could just set the forecast document to approval without even opening BFA. The thing about doing that is that unless you open BFA, there is actually no project financial snapshot taken. So we didn't have the point in time data that was necessary to drive Seco's construction's variance reports. They track 2 forecasts a month at Seco, where they compare the accounting version of the forecast to the project manager's version of the forecast and watch the variance in between them. And they're really paying close attention over there. What would happen in the case where the project manager took a shortcut that was good for him is that there'd be gaps in the forecast variance history when they went to look at it. And that would cause, oh, well, where did data go? And even support calls would get made saying, something went wrong. And it all turned out to be just that the project manager tried to save a minute. So what did we do for these folks? It was a very simple solution in this case that when the project manager attempts to set the forecasting document to PM approved, a special status that SECO uses to help track the different kinds of forecasts that they've got going on, that we would check and make sure that there had been a financial snapshot taken and stored. And if not, it tells them even what to do. You have to open BFA so that they are told right in their face what to do if they try to skip the step. How do we pull this one off? This is a third approach that we used for SECO's solution, and it uses a little bit of our workflow scripts. And the workflow script just says if the status is changing and it's changing to that specific status code, F must be PM approved. It runs a check. That query there is going to be a tiny little bit of SQL that we helped them put together that checks to see if there's been a financial snapshot taken. And if not, you can see it builds the message and displays the message if the count of data for the snapshot is 0. So that's a very simple, and workflow is great. It tends to happen on saves or thereabouts, but it's much easier to deploy than SQL backend changes because it is through the user interface of the web application.
Next.
Yes.
Okay. So the next topic we're talking about is change items. And changes obviously happen all the time in projects, and we're talking about changes on the level of the owner change order or the client change order. People call these things different things. Whether you create items on a potential change order or a change order, they are all listed on the one change item register on the project. That's the place that it keeps track of all of those potential and actual change items. And so that is certainly one way that we envision people using the register to have that list of all of them. But not all our clients do things in the same way. So what was happening over at THARP?
Okay. So as Sony just mentioned, not every client listens to the way Spitfire says stuff can be done because there's traditions, there's old ways of doing things, there's a desire for simplicity even. So at THARP, they were used to, we don't need the change item register, we don't need potential change orders, even though clearly they're dealing with what we would think of as potential changes. They focus entirely on owner change orders. All of the work is done on those documents ahead of time, so that some of them are going to happen this month, some of them may not happen for 3 months, others may never be gotten around to, right? But they're doing all of the work from the one document type. There are, of course, the monthly review meetings where, okay, this month we're pulling the trigger on A, B, and C, or more likely A, B, and F, right? So that they pick which ones are going forward. And the back office now will, they call bundle those different change orders into the one that's going to go forward. But we talked about projects getting canceled a little earlier, and of course, sometimes change orders get canceled, or there's, hey, wait a second, we want to do this one, we got to rush on this one now too. Things change. That's part of life. And Spitfire, once they had resolved one of those owner change orders into a bundled state, wouldn't let them back that out. It's one of the things, typically change orders are a posting document, so reversing some things is limited for end users. So they would need us to intervene to change the status back. It's an inconvenience. It took time for, they'd have to wait an hour or whatever number of hours for support to get around to it. So how did we help them out? With this, in this one, we managed to address the situation by adding a button onto the screen. And that button was sensitive to what was going on the document. So you can see this one has a status of bundled right this moment. So it adds the unbundle button. It doesn't add the unbundle button for everyone, but just folks who have the right business admin role. What does that mean? That's just a role that they have over at THARP, and the people who are allowed to do this action have been placed into that role. The button can run with a little more permission than the user and do something that the user wouldn't be allowed to do, sort of like support can do things that users aren't allowed to do. So how did we pull that off for them? Okay, so we've seen JavaScript and workflow script before, and here's an example that does a little tiny bit of both. There's a small snippet of JavaScript that decides when to put a button on the screen. And you can see when that button is clicked on, the green highlighted line runs a workflow script. So this one is great in that category of things that can all be deployed from the web user interface. The little bit of JavaScript to decide when and who should see a button, and then a really tiny workflow script that just basically sets the status to I, because workflow script can do things that users can't typically do. Got to be careful with that, of course. You want to test that and make sure it's actually an okay thing to do and doesn't hurt your business practices. But obviously this has been well tested and is an appropriate thing to have happen. What's next?
Well, something else was going on at THARP related to this.
Yeah. So a lot of the things we've talked about so far have been in that errors and omissions or difficult actions that aren't possible for users and simplifying them. This is a little different than all the things we've talked about so far, because it's a optimization of a procedure. Again, they're using change orders to go and do things using the get item. And if we could just change some of the defaults so that their workflow is a little more efficient for them on a month in, month out basis, obviously there'd be a return on that investment. So remind me what we did for THARP. Okay. Many of you will recognize this part of the workflow, that change items are moved. If in the case of a potential or change item register, you move them onto your monthly change order through the get existing option. And indeed, THARP is doing the same thing. They're just moving them from one change order to another using get existing. But the lookup didn't give them all of the information they needed. For example, it did not reference the change order numbers, it referenced the change item numbers. So we can see the last column, we added the change order document number down there for them. And we also exposed the revenue amount for them, since that helped them verify that, oh, well, I'm looking for that $10,000 thing for the air compressor. They would be able to put 2 and 2 together and go a little faster in picking which item to get from the get item. So this is a change to a Spitfire lookup is what we did here to improve their productivity. How did we pull that one off? Yeah, since it's a change to a lookup, it does have a different look to how it was done. This is a tiny bit of SQL code that updates or changes the definition, because all of Spitfire's lookups are stored, they're data driven, so that just tweaking the data that defines the lookup has the effect of making a column visible or making it a default. And the important piece in deploying something like this is that when you change something that Spitfire ships, many of our older clients have definitely seen this in the past, you have to protect against Spitfire reasserting its defaults during a version upgrade. So this code has to be deployed so that it happens every morning, so that you never wind up in a situation where the Spitfire defaults slip back into place. And we have this cool note on the bottom. THARP is still on version 2017. I believe they're in the early stages of planning their upgrade to version 2019. And I have promised that they're going to get even more streamlining for their SOP once they get to 2019. Got good things coming for them. What's next?
Okay, so now we're talking about programs and how a lot of how Spitfire supports the idea of programs as a way to group related projects. So you can think of programs as the large tent under which several projects reside. And once a program has been set up, users can indicate that a specific project belongs to that program. And normally you do that by going over on the project setup, you go over to the project tab and you go select the program. And so this is the way we have things set up. But Stan will tell you about a particular client site where this wasn't quite enough.
And another anonymous client at that. And I realized because of anonymous clients, I stopped talking about the different clients. I'm sorry. So, as Sony described, programs are a fairly static thing for most of you. I see a few names here that I recognize and some that I don't, but some of you I know are using programs. They may be representing a city, a program with a city, or they might be a group of projects all related by location or whatever you're using for. Programs are rare and they don't come and go very often. And not every project is in a program. Well, for this particular client, every single project is in a program. And when you're doing it that way, in fact, they even went so far as to use the first segment of their project ID to indicate which program it was. And so that's how integral it is into their day-to-day operations. When you've got that, you might imagine that you're going to be having more programs than the rest, our average clients do. So if a new project, if you're starting to do the process of creating a new project and that requires a new program as well, now you're interrupted. Your workflow isn't smooth anymore. You're on the create project screen. You got to go back to manage programs and go set the program up, which is only a few steps, but it's still disruptive. So given their heavy use of the programs, we realized that they needed a much easier way to create programs while creating projects. So let's see what we did for them. You may recall seeing in the What's New webinars, the add a contact on the fly. Well, we kind of stole a page from that book and we deployed an add a program on the fly feature. And so you can see in the first image how their first segment is a program ID. And when they have entered the digits of the program ID, if it doesn't find it, it pops up the Create New Program dialog right there on the project setup window where they can sort of verify the ID and give the program a name. That's really all there is to a program, is those two attributes and the list of projects that belong to it. So once they click Finish, they can proceed with the rest of the project setup without ever being interrupted and having to go somewhere else. Of course, what's the bottom picture here is showing the typical manage program screen where you can see that the program is added there. It's not like we're cheating. It is being added to the program list where you'd expect it to be. How did we do this one? If you've been paying attention at home, you may realize, oh, that's right on the screen in real time, and that should make you be thinking that must be JavaScript, right? We're going to have a quiz at the end. The JavaScript in this case, you can see the autocomplete response is kind of hooking into and watching what choices are the autocomplete is getting when it does the little autocomplete queries in the background. And the green highlighted part is saying, well, if I got no choices from that autocomplete, I better put myself in the quick add mode to pop up that add program dialog. It's that simple. No choices from the autocomplete meant that program doesn't exist yet. What's next?
Okay, so we're talking about budgets and actual cost tracking, because a project budget doesn't just indicate budgeted amounts. The BFA workbook also tracks actual costs for different account categories. For example, the self-performed labor, subcontracted labor, and even labor burden. So these numbers are all there to begin with, but sometimes, as we see, things need to change, even on
Mhm.
an account category to account category basis. So what was happening at KenPat?
Yeah, this is one of my favorite ones for sure. First, I will say a couple of words about KenPat. They're a specialty subcontractor for sure, and again are in a similar model where they have one back office that is handling some number of divisions or groups within. They are a very busy and productive group, and they budget or quote or win jobs having budgeted everything as if they will self-perform it. They're going to do all the work in-house effectively with their teams, but they're really good and they're really busy. So what winds up happening in quote real life is that a percentage of that self-perform work in real time on the job site is swapped out. They actually bring in subcontracted labor to do and satisfy the scheduling demand. You got to stay on time, right? So they're switching the scenario from self-performed to subcontracted. That's not an obvious and easy thing to do. The budget, they spend time estimating and budgeting all of this work with the self-performed labor and corresponding labor burden. They have their formula for what the labor burden should be, etc. That's great. But now that money isn't being used. So it's going to look like, gee, we're not using any of that money in our budget. And every subcontract that was created sort of on the fly would look like it was in the red over budget because it's a different line in the budget detail. That's kind of messy and it's going to make every project hard to process. Am I making money or am I not making money on this project? Right? The key is that KenPat doesn't know in advance how much labor will be farmed out versus how much they actually will do in-house. And that to change from in-house labor and burden to a subcontract requires a CCO and a budget revision. We'll talk about that a little more in detail, but the part I want to emphasize right now is that for some of the things we've talked about, it's been the rarity of it. Oh, we only cancel a couple of projects a year, or the PM sometimes gets to think he's taking a shortcut. KenPat has to do this because they're busy multiple times per week. They have, oh, we had to use subcontracted labor on these 8 jobs, whatever number, 8 weeks, 8 times a week, doing CCOs and budget revisions. Think of the work that cascaded out of this and how complex it would become. So what did we do for KenPat? Phew. All right. The beauty of it is it was a very rote process that clearly once you realize that it's driven by the fact that I've got to pay my subcontractor for doing the work this week, the payment request becomes the launch pad. And if you could just automatically say, well, I've got to get the money in for that subcontractor, and I understand that that money is coming from labor and burden, it's just math to figure out what the dollar amount to draw from labor and burden. They are, oh, I should have mentioned this earlier. I have to praise KenPat that they are incredibly good at their budgets are very consistent. They're not haphazard at all. You can predict where the corresponding lines are. So kudos for them for having a good SOP and creating their budget structures. Right? So during that payment request approval, all we need to do is automatically create that CCO to increase the value of the subcontract so that the subcontract will not appear to be over budget or overpaid. You'd be careful about my words. The subcontract isn't overpaid. The cap can be kept turned on. And of course, that we want to move the money on the budget lines as well, so that the budget line doesn't appear to be in the red when you're looking at it, not from a subcontract perspective, but when you're looking at it on a actual to budget variance report. You can see here what all the screenshot is showing is how many, this is one project, and you can see the week in, week out, this 4.2, 4.10, 4.17, the number of adjustments that would be required if you tried to do them by hand, as they used to. There was a period when KenPat tried to keep up with this. But remember, they're busy and their time is valuable. How did we pull all this off? Okay. Sort of the key here is that we were talking about doing something on the approval of a subcontract payment request, and creating a lot of documents, CCOs, and budget revisions on the fly. So this was done using one of those SQL backend save extensions, and had to pick a little snippet of code to show this is 6 out of 900 lines of code. So this one wasn't trivial. I think we took 3 months or so to work with them and get all of the wrinkles out. But it's used week in and week out at KenPat now, and has increased their throughput and productivity. Lots of return on investment for this one. What's next?
Okay, so next we're talking about commitments of a purchase order subtype, because commitments is what we call those documents that are both subcontracts and purchase orders, and some people use them specifically, or at least they use them also as purchase orders. Now, while subcontracts might not use items on them, purchase orders often, maybe even usually do. And whether you call them units or quantity, you can see down there that's both quantity and current units are down there. But unit tracking is something that is very common on a purchase order. But what was happening at this client that used to be called Remington?
A client formerly known as Remington. They've changed their name recently. So at Remington, they do a ton of material purchases. That is a huge part of what they're tracking, and they track it very closely and carefully. Spitfire, over the years, certainly in 2018 and 2019, we track units of measure and when quantities are allowed very carefully. We don't let you put in quantities times you're not supposed to. But what's much harder is knowing that you must put in a quantity. So what Remington needed, I keep falling back on their old name, they'll just have to live with that. What Remington needed was a way to make sure that no one ever forgot to put in the units, the number of widgets that were being bought, right, for this project we delivered. Because each commitment change order needs to have quantities. Otherwise, it begins to look like there was a price per unit change, rather than just needing more of them. So it's very important that there was consistency. And fixing them after the fact was time. Finding them and fixing them after the fact, oh, don't want to go there. So how did we address all that? Okay, so users are prevented. No, this site is still on version 2016, so the JavaScript option, not so much for them, and maybe we could even come back and improve some of this and make it more responsive. But right now it all happens when they try to save, that the back end logic can check and see that there's a line. You can notice that the line has the MAT. That's how we can even know that this is a material line. If so, a contract that involved both, theoretically, if they ever did this, I don't think they mix this way, but if there was ever both a material and the labor line on the same subcontract, it would know only to pay attention to quantities being required on the things that are actually materials. So this is a very sensitive way of enforcing for them the fact that units of measure and quantity must be specified on materials, and making sure it's not forgotten. How did we do this for? sort of hinted that wasn't being done in the front end, being done in a SQL save extension, and it's done. You can see just the snippet that was chosen is a snippet that is picking and checking to see that there's no, where quantity is 0 is basically the most important part of that, and it builds the message out of the other pieces of information on the line. It's very simple and straightforward once it gets to this part. What's next?
Okay, so we started this earlier on, and I talked about how people take information from the estimates in order to build their budgets. And this is done through the import wizard, and a key part of that process is getting the data into a format so that it can be used by the import wizard. And now I'm going to hand the mic over to Dennis. Actually, he's going to talk about the next two client examples that we have here, and he will talk specifically about what was happening at Bailey Construction.
Well, thank you, Sony. And thanks everybody for joining us. Bailey is a commercial construction company. They've been in business since 1963, so they must be doing something right. They have 3 locations out on the West Coast, and the company has multiple divisions, and they offer a variety of different services. Now, they've been a Spitfire client since about 2006. Back in mid-2018, we actually provided a service called a process audit for Bailey, in which case we identified a variety of different items where we could help them and how we could reconfigure their system to match the changes in their business over the last 10 years. In that process audit, we specifically talked to one area called the Special Projects Division, and we identified a fairly big challenge there that allowed us to do very little work but to end up with a big payoff. The Special Projects Division actually handles all the smaller, less complicated, but fast turnaround projects. And with this high volume of projects, there is really an increased demand on efficiencies in the administrative component of that particular project. During the process audit, we took a look at how much time it took them to convert a detailed estimate into a budget for management purposes. All right, so they were actually doing this manually, and it took several hours on every project to actually do this conversion. And it also required some pretty extensive expertise as to how to actually look at the estimate and then convert it into the element that they needed. And through that process, they were actually manually changing the data. They were moving it from one Excel workbook to another Excel workbook, and so manually adjusting data in that sense. And in many cases through this process, when they went to the final action, which was importing the data into Spitfire, the import wizard would stall because they may have invalid cost codes or duplicate cost codes and a variety of different pieces. So it was a real problem for them, bottom line. So what did we do from the site side of things? Sony? Okay, great. So what we did is Bailey was already using a workbook, and so we took that workbook as a starting point, and we came along, we added a couple of buttons, as you can see here. I don't know if I have keyboard, but basically we can see these yellow or these colored buttons here. So we added a couple of command buttons in there that actually streamlined some of the processes. What we also did is we added a estimate document or activated an estimate document inside Spitfire, and on that document we added this workbook as a auto attachment. During the creation of a project, the estimate document is automatically attached as well as this particular item. So the workflow that they follow now is that they open up the estimate document and they go down to the attachments and they launch this workbook that's been attached. the next step they do is they use the orange button there called the Get Source. And what this does is opens up a standard file find pop-up, the same one as you use in Microsoft all the time when you're trying to find a file in your file system. That's the one it's using basically. And they go and they find the source document or the ICE output that they want to use. ICE is, by the way, their estimating tools that they use. It's called ICE, and they use that. So they go and find the output from the ICE item that they're targeting. What the system does then is once they've selected it, it actually digests the ICE output. And basically what it does is it goes along and uses some of that intelligence that the folks were using to convert that information and puts it into the columns you see across and creating each individual row. Now the next thing it does, or allows them to do, is estimating is usually done at a fairly granular level, so you have a lot of different rows that you want to consolidate into a budget row. So the green button there allowed them to identify a variety of different rows in this workbook and consolidate them into one specific row for import purposes. And that made life a whole bunch easier because instead of taking amounts manually and adding them up and putting them into a different item, the system would do it automatically behind the scenes. The final step in the process of this workbook was the cost code validation. As I mentioned many times, the import process would stall because they either had duplicate cost codes and or they had invalid cost code numbers when they would try and validate against the ERP solution. So the blue button there allows them to do that. They just push the button and it reviews all of the cost codes they have in the list here against the validated list, and if one of the items doesn't validate, it actually pops up with, you should be using this number, or you could be using any one of these numbers. Please select, and then they're allowed to select it, and the system will go ahead and make the changes. So that's what we did at the front end as far as improvements were concerned. So how was it done? So basically what we did is we just used the power of the VBA code within the workbook itself. We embedded the expert knowledge needed to interpret that ICE workbook. So now it's not just somebody's writing it down how to do it and one person's knowledge. We embedded that directly into the workbook itself. So now the workbook has the understanding, we need to do this with that with this, and onwards. We also embedded that merging capability, which was very important. Most of the organizations do take a very extensive view of their estimate, and then they consolidate those estimating details into line items to manage the project. And the last piece that we incorporated into the workbook itself was that validation process of being able to take all those cost codes and make sure that they were going to roll right through the import stage. So what used to take several hours to compile has now been reduced to minutes. The data integrity throughout the process has been improved dramatically because of the fact that they're not actually touching the amounts in dollars. The system has already gathered that information and is rolling it through and using the numbers. And computers are pretty good with that. They don't screw up the numbers too often. And so what took several attempts to import the project budget now takes an easy click and go. So what we looked at is the insanity, and we provided a solution that was quick, easy, and anyone can use this and get predictable results.
Great. And last, we have this topic about supplemental workbooks, because Spitfire allows you to create or have us create for you any number of supplemental workbooks that can use data from the project budgets to present data in new ways, or to take parts of data and put it together for some sort of reporting purposes. Those supplemental workbooks are open from the BFA workbook. And Dennis will now, in 9 minutes or less, will tell you what was happening at Silverman.
Okay, I'll make this quick, but I hope to do Silverman, who was online justice for this particular piece. Silverman is a construction program management organization. They're basically an owner's representative, and they provide services to the owner-developer marketplace. They're based out of Atlanta, Georgia, And it's my understanding they'll soon be celebrating 25 years in business, and
Ooh.
congratulations at the early stage. They handle projects all across the United States. They've been with us since 2007, and Arnie and his team have taught us a lot about commitment, so we thank you for that as well, Arnie. One of the benefits that Arnie's team brings to the negotiating table is their ability to oversee massive projects. And many of their projects that they do have multiple phases within them. And a phase, if you will, can be associated to a projects within a project, if you will. They also have some very demanding clients. A lot of them are cities and corporations of that nature. And as far as Silverman is concerned, their reputation is they are very accommodating. So when the customer asks for something specific, that's how they serve it up. Now, in the area of reporting, they have some very specialized reporting for the clients. Multi-phase projects increase the complexity of that reporting component, especially when the client asks for variations on those specific combinations. And as we mentioned earlier, Silverman has been using us BFA supplemental workbooks quite extensively over the years. But when the client asks for a mix and match, it often poses a specific challenge. And what they've been doing up to this point is taking already produced reports and then manually recompiling them into what the client is looking for. So what we did at the site improvements here, if you just want to pop along to the next round, is we actually took one of their standard supplemental workbooks as a starting point. We then added in a grid component here. You can see it in the center where all the little bubbles are pointing into. And that grid is populated, predicated on the actual workbook or the BFA document that it was supported from. So the grid populates automatically. And it allows them to go ahead and select which combinations need to be included or which phases need to be included in this output report. It also allows them to change the name should they require. And then we added a little go button at the top there that just allows them to hit the button and make it happen. So with all that said and done, how was it done? Okay, again, using the power of VBA, we embedded that grid and then we auto-populate it with the information directly from the BFA workbook. Then we allowed the assembly code or the code that actually creates the report to respect the choices from the actual grid itself. So now with the click of a go button, the hours required to manually recompile the reports is transformed into minutes when the system actually pulls this information together. So we took a look at the sanity and came up with a quick solution that's easy to use and has very predictable results. So I hope that was under 9 minutes.
Thank you, Dennis. It is indeed. In fact, we have 5 minutes left if anybody wants to ask a question or make a comment. And certainly we hope that we have given you, by giving you these examples, that you might be able to go and identify some of those insanity points at your place of work, where whether it's something that people keep stumbling and making the same little mistake over and over, that maybe we can prevent that, or on the other side, if there's some sort of process that just is taking hours to do and it can be simplified, and now then you'd be able to do it in very few minutes. So as always, we are here if you ever want to send an email over into support to say we want help with this. And I should stop talking in case anybody does want to say anything. Okay, it seems to be kind of quiet, in which case we just gave them a lot to think about. In which case we hope you will come back next month, where we are going to do a deep dive into the UI configuration tool. And Stan's going to be telling you that one, so you know it's going to be maybe a little techy, but it's also going to be showing what's possible through the UI configuration tool. So everybody is welcome to come back to that one. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Sony and Stan.
Thanks.